Okay, now let's try this again. So people have a lot of preconceived notions about what finance is all about, but oftentimes when it gets down to it, there's just quite a lot of misleading information. It even comes down to the notion of what finance is. If I asked you to explain what is finance to, like, let's say an 8-year-old, how would you explain what finance is? Anybody want to give this a shot? This is undoubtedly trickier than it seems, right? What is finance?
How we spend our money, or like how we can spend our money?
Yeah, but if I go and buy a donut, that's not really finance, right? I mean, I don't think that's the definition that we want to focus on. Any other ideas by anybody? Ryan, you got any ideas about what finance might be? If you had to explain this to a little sibling, how would you explain what finance is? Any guesses?
There's some stuff in the chat like managing and prioritizing our earnings, the collective movement of currencies between firms, countries, how we move our money around, stuff like that.
I'm sorry. For some reason, it wasn't showing up in my chat. How we manage and prioritize our earnings, the collective movement of currencies between firms, how we move our money around. Yeah, I mean, all of these are kind of it. Krista, you might actually come closest, but I think you're missing an important part, because finance is not just moving money around, okay? What exactly is finance? To me, the best definition of finance is just simply trading money across time. With conditions attached. Right? That's really, in the essence, what finance is. It's trading money across time. In other words, trading money today for money in the future. Right? Trading money today for money in the future. That really is what finance is. And so, you can get caught up in, a stock and a bond and dividends and interest rates and blah, blah, blah. But really, in the essence, what finance is it's trading money across time, trading money today for money in the future. And of course, with conditions attached is an important part of this. It's the conditions attached to it that make for different types of finance, right? So a bond is really very similar to a stock, except that there's different conditions attached to trading money today for money in the future. Likewise, you can get into any sort of complicated financial instrument. All these financial instruments are basically trading money today for money tomorrow. The difference is some of these conditions are straightforward, like a bank loan is pretty straightforward, and some of them, like a subprime mortgage bond, is quite complicated, right? But in its essence, that's all finance is. Now, when you put it so simply, it's kind of tempting to say, well, that's not such a big deal, right? Trading money today for money tomorrow. Why is that such a big deal? Well, it is. Because as a practical matter, and this is where we're going to pick up on money. My tongue is tied this morning. On Monday, is we're going to begin to talk about the sources of economic growth. And one of the things we're going to see is that finance is closely tied to all of the sources of economic growth. Trading money today for money in the future is an important aspect of creating growth. And so let's talk about why that is. One of the reasons, clearly, is that finance gets resources to those with the most productive uses for them. You have to think about finance as the first step in entrepreneurship, in innovation. Oftentimes, innovation in entrepreneurship simply does not take place unless we have finance. Why? I think the reason why is there any reason to expect that the people who have money are also the people that have the best ideas for how to use that money? No, there's no expectation of that. In fact, I have to say, in my experience, some of the people that have money are the least capable of using it effectively, right? So how in the world do we make sure that a person who has a great idea can get the resources to put that money into action? That's what financial systems do. Financial systems match up people who have money with people who have great ideas for them, right? And so that's maybe the number one reason why finance is so important. You have to think about financial system, and I'll use this analogy a lot. But a financial system is kind of like the brain of an economy. In many ways, your financial system is the brain of your economy. In the sense that, what does your brain do? One of the very important functions that your brain does is make sure that resources get to where they're needed, right? If you walk around the corner and you see a lion, what is your brain going to do? It is going to start pumping adrenaline and blood into your muscles so that you can get the hell out of there, right? And that in many ways is what a financial system does. When an economy needs resources, if your financial system is working properly, your financial system is going to help it get resources. And, you know, as we're going to talk about on Monday, this is one of the things that we observe about poor countries. Poor countries have dysfunctional financial systems. And so as a result, it's essentially like they have brain damage, right? In that the resources that they have cannot be used effectively because there's no way to get the resources they have to the people who can use them most effectively. Right? So a financial system in many ways is like this huge coordination mechanism, right? It's crucial for improving the lives of people, right? As Americans, I'm going to talk about this here in a minute, but we really have because most of us have had access to finance our entire life, we have no real appreciation of all of the benefits that finance provides us because most of us have grown up with it. One of the reasons why finance provides so much benefit to us as individuals, and this might sound strange at first, but finance actually is a way of reducing risk. We think about finances kind of like, some of us think about finances like, you know, going to a casino. But in reality, finance is about risk mitigation, right? It's about risk mitigation. Finance gives us tons of ways to reduce risk, such as diversification. Not saving our money in one place, but to save it in many places. Liquidity. Liquidity is a fancy word for turning an asset into money. Right? So, you know, one of the really attractive things about the US financial markets is that when you buy a bond or a stock, it's usually pretty easy to sell those if you need to, right? And that's reduces your risk, right? If you need money quickly, for the most part, many different types of financial assets are relatively easy to sell. You can pool your money, right? Meaning, if somebody needs to borrow, if you need to borrow for college, you don't have to borrow from just one person. you can essentially borrow from the entire society when you get a loan from the government or when you get a loan from a bank. And then, of course, finance just reduces our risk because it's there, right? Most of us have the luxury of having a credit card, that if there's some sort of unexpected expense that comes up, we can put it on our credit card, right? That is a luxury that many people in many other countries simply don't have. And it significantly increases the risk of their lives, right? Because in many other countries, if you get sick and you need $10,000, there's really no way you can do it other than maybe borrow from family and friends, right? Which may not be possible. Finance helps create incentives to save and invest. It's a way to get a return on your saving. So once again, this is something that we take for granted. Many people in many countries have simply no access to finance. Actually, there are people in the United States that don't have access to finance, right? About 20% of Americans do not have a bank account, right? Which is kind of a shocking number. So if you don't have a bank account, how do you save? Help me out here. If you don't have a bank account, how do you save?
Cash under the bed?
Yeah, exactly. Put it under the bed, right? But what's your return on putting your money in your mattress? It's zero. In fact, it's less than zero because inflation's going to eat away at the value of that money over time, right? You get very little return for savings. In other countries, what they'll do is they'll save by purchasing assets. For instance, a very common form of saving in many poor countries is to buy livestock, like a goat or a cow, right? I mean, that's a legitimate way of savings. The problem with that, as many economists have actually figured, is what is your return on buying a cow? It's actually likely negative, right? If you factor in not only how much you have to spend for the cow, but how much you have to feed it and take care of it, your return is very, very low. In fact, it's probably negative, but it beats putting your money in a hole in the ground where somebody can steal it. And so these are the kind of decisions that many people have to make, right? Is they have very, very few options for actually getting a return on their savings. And then, so if you have a financial system, the financial system gives people a return to savings. When it accumulates savings, what does it then do? It turns that into investment. So when you save your money in a bank, where does that money go? It's going to go to a firm who, for instance, wants to make an investment in capital or wants to make an investment in research and development. And so really what a financial system does, if I could draw a little graph here, is a financial system increases savings and turns it into investment, right? That is in many ways what a financial system does that's working well, is it encourages savings and it turns that into an investment. Sonny says, invest in the local marijuana business. You could double your return on savings. Yeah, don't do that in Iowa, Sonny, please. At least not yet. Maybe in a couple years. All right. A couple of other things about finance. Finance reduces transaction costs, right? It makes it easier to trade. I don't have to convince you of this. You all have credit cards, right? Or you all use Venmo, right? Or whatever. All of these, you might think that it's kind of just like an app and information technology, but of course, what underlies credit cards and Venmo? A financial system, right? There's a financial system. Somebody's lending money to Venmo so that they have money to transfer between people, right? And Venmo is directly tied to a credit card or to your bank account. So yeah, there's a financial system here at work. And without it, you would not have credit cards. You would not have Venmo. Something else we would not have without a financial system is insurance. And many of you have never really thought about how insurance works, like life insurance, health insurance, fire. But let me say that really insurance companies are a lot like banks. I mean, in many ways, an insurance company is a bank, okay? In the sense that how does insurance work? You put money into the insurance company, and then what does the insurance company do? Gives you money in the event of you getting sick, or you having a fire, or you retiring, right? In many ways, it's very much like a bank. And in fact, insurance companies in many ways are regulated like banks because they are essentially banks, right? They're just a different form of bank. And so you will not have an insurance industry if you don't have a financial industry, right? Zach says, but then they don't pay out during the derecho. Well, okay, yeah, maybe. Maybe. So anyway, these are just a few, and I could keep on going on and on about this, as you might be able to tell by my rambling. This is one of my areas of economic research, looking at the relationship between financial development and economic development. But when you look at the data here, and for those of you who've traveled abroad and traveled to less developed countries, one of the big differences you notice between the rich world and the less developed world is their financial system. Having a financial system is like a huge safety net, right, for everybody, right? It makes everything simpler. It gives everybody a backup. And it's one of the things that significantly improves quality of life. And so financial systems are really, really important, right? And so I know as Americans, because we've always had access to finance, it's sometimes hard for us to appreciate just how important that finance is. But when you go to a country that doesn't, you begin to see how incredibly important it is. Now, as we talk about this, I want to really emphasize an important distinction here that often can create confusion. And that is the difference between savings and investment. Okay, so this is a good example of one of the things that we're constantly striving for in this class, which is to use our language more concretely and more exactly. In everyday life, we often use savings and investment as essentially synonyms, right? We'll use these to denote the same kind of activities. But economists mean something different, distinct, when we talk about savings and investment. And so I want us to be very clear about the difference here between savings and investment. What is investment? We've talked about investment when we talked about GDP. It's the purchase of investment goods, capital, new housing, research and development, right? When we talked about GDP, we talked about what investment is. It's the purchase of investment goods. What then is savings? Savings is postponing consumption. Savings is the act of not spending, and investment is the act of spending on investment goods. Okay? So these things are distinct. And like I said, this can create a lot of confusion because we often don't distinguish between these things in real life. So somebody help me out here. If I put money in the stock market, what am I doing? Am I saving or am I investing?
Investing.
Any other guesses? My pause, there's only one other option. You are saving. When you put money in the stock market, you are saving, meaning you are not spending today, you are postponing your consumption for the future. Now, when I put that money and I buy a share of IBM stock, IBM takes that money and they go and build a factory. What's IBM doing? Investing. Okay? So households are typically the ones who do the savings. And it's typically firms who do the investment. So you can see why this creates some confusion, and we need to be straight about this because economists need to make a distinction between these two activities, between postponing consumption, which is saving, and between purchasing investment, which is purchasing investment goods, which is investment. But in everyday life, like I said, we don't use these words very concretely. And so, yeah, don't get confused about this, right? I mean, yes, most people, when they talk about putting money in the stock market, they talk about investing in the stock market. But according to an economist, you are not investing in the stock market. You are saving in the stock market.
So like if like an individual were to buy like real estate, would that then be considered an investment because it's new housing? Or
Right. So if an individual bought new housing, that would be an investment, right? If you bought a new house, that would be an example of an investment good. So there you would not be saving, you would actually be purchasing investment goods. Okay. So that's the difference between savings and investment. And what does a financial system do? Basically, what financial systems do is they match savings with investment. So you have firms that want to invest and you have households that save. And what does a financial system do? It essentially helps turn that savings into an investment. So you can see how we as economists here can turn something that I bet you thought you know into something that you don't understand. Right? In the sense that you're probably coming into this discussion, you're like, oh yeah, finance, I know what that is, right? Until you begin to think about it more carefully and then you realize, whoa, this is complicated, right? Because there's really multiple activities going on here. And what a financial system does is it matches up those who have extra resources with now, those who have extra resources now, to those who need money now, right? And so that's what a financial system will do. To understand this relationship a little bit better, let's talk about this another way of thinking about the relationship between savings and investment. And this other way is, I would say, a little bit more algebraic way, right? That might help us lead to a little bit different intuition. Let's go back to our old friend, the expenditure equation. Remember this oldie but goodie? It's not too old because it's just from a couple days ago, right? That y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus m. And we know the C is consumption and I is investment, G is government purchases, X is exports, M is imports. Okay. Now, to begin with, let's assume that we have a closed economy. And what a closed economy means is that there's no international trade. So let's just kind of drop X and M from this for now. So that then we're left with Y is equal to C plus I plus G. Okay. Now I just want to rework this like this. I'm going to put C and G on one side and then leave I on that side, the right hand side. What is this? Total income minus consumption minus government purchases. Total income minus private spending minus government spending. Total income minus total spending. What would we call total income minus total spending?
Profit?
Not profit. For you in your own personal checkbook, what's the difference between your saving, or I'm sorry, what's the difference between your income and your spending?
Savings.
Your savings, right? This is total savings. What has to be true in a closed economy? Savings has to equal investment, right? In other words, money has to come from somewhere. If you're investing it, the only way you can have money to invest is if you save. The only way you can invest is if you save. Remember though, this is in a closed economy. So it has to be true that in a closed economy, savings is equal to investment. Okay? So in a closed economy, these two things have to be the same. What about in an open economy? Let's go back and rethink about this in an open economy. Okay, so let's go back and add X minus M in here. Okay. Now I'm going to move everything over to the left-hand side. Like this. What's this in the parentheses again? Savings. Savings minus investment is equal to X minus M. What's X minus M again? How do we interpret that? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear whoever said something. It was kind of garbled. Easton, was that you?
Yeah, exports and imports.
Exports and imports. So this is basically net exports, right? Or our trade balance. And this is the difference between savings and investment. Okay, what happens if you're in a country in which your savings is less than investment? What's going to be the implication? If savings and less is investment, the left-hand side is going to be negative. What does that mean about your trade balance? You run a trade deficit. And what happens if your savings is greater than investment? You run a trade surplus. Whoa, wait a second. Nobody ever told me that our trade deficits are related to how much we save and invest. I thought it was just China that was screwing us over. No. Right? Here is another example of where many people listen too much to politicians and don't think about the economics. Why do we run a trade deficit in the US? Quite simple. We don't save enough. We have savings less than investment. When you are in a country and you have savings less than investment, what happens? You run a trade deficit. You also, the flip side of this is that you are a foreign borrower. Right? The flip side of having a trade deficit is that you borrow to pay for that trade deficit. So we essentially borrow from foreign countries. How do we do that? By selling them our financial assets. As we're going to talk about later, US government bonds are hugely attractive to foreigners, in part because of this thing. We run a big trade deficit. And so as a result, we end up borrowing from foreign countries by essentially selling them our bonds and stocks. This is the US. We save too little relative to our investment. That is the fundamental reason why we have a trade deficit. It is not because of China, right? It is because of us. We do it to ourselves because we don't save enough to cover our investment. It's just math, okay? It's hardly even math, it's algebra, right? I mean, this is just simple algebra. And yet many politicians don't understand this, choose not to understand this. What about China? Why does China run a big trade surplus? Well, once again, it's just math for them. They, contrary to us, have a high level of savings in their country. And so what's the result? When you have a high level of savings, you're going to tend to run a trade surplus and you're going to be a foreign lender. What are you going to do with all that savings? Some of that savings you're going to lend abroad. And that's essentially what the situation that China has found itself in. Or another country like this would be Germany, right? For most of Europe, Germany is their China, if that makes any sense. Just like we run a big trade deficit with China and are a big foreign borrower from China, Germany runs a big trade surplus with the rest of Europe and is a big foreign lender to the rest of Europe. It's just accounting, right? It's just accounting. And so this, if you understand this, you really already understand a lot more about international trade and finance than most politicians do. I'm going to pick on Donald Trump here because, because I can. But, when it comes to, I should say right off the bat that when it comes to not understanding this relationship, Democrats can be just as guilty as Republicans. But here's just a graph of the US trade deficit. And here you see what happened to the US trade deficit when Donald Trump took over. Despite all of his complaining and threats and trade war, etc., what happened to the US trade deficit? It went up. Why did it go up? Because what happened to our national savings? It went down, right? And largely our national savings went down because the government ran big budget deficits. As we're going to talk about later, a big chunk of this, our national savings, is what we as households save, but also what the government saves. And so when the government runs big trade deficits, that reduces national savings. And so it's simple algebra that when the US government saves less, that's going to tend to drive up the trade deficit. And that's exactly what we saw. Right? That's exactly what we saw during the Trump administration. So despite getting in a trade war with China, with the express purpose of reducing the trade deficit, economists knew all along that that was not going to reduce the trade deficit, because the trade deficit is not, this is very counterintuitive, but the trade deficit is really not governed by trade policy. It's much more closely related to how much your savings and how much your investment is. And so, right, that's what's happened, right? We ran bigger government deficits under Trump. We saved less. As a result, we ran a bigger trade deficit and we borrowed more, right? And so, yeah, it's just simple algebra, right? And so we'll come back to this a number of times, but sometimes it can be astonishing the things that people believe, right? And here I'm kind of ripping on Trump, but there's members of both parties, right, who find it a lot easier to blame China than to actually think about, well, what kind of policies has the U.S. enacted that has actually driven up this trade deficit, right? And a lot of those policies, as we'll talk about, are directly related to our trade balance, directly related to our government budget deficit. Okay, so let's switch gears here a little bit and talk about interest rates, right? Because interest rates are obviously one of the important parts of a financial system. Right? Okay, so let's talk about the determination of interest rates. I hate to do this. There's hell breaking out upstairs. I think the roofers are here and, okay, now it's quiet. I think they're trying to get in to use the bathroom, but they can't find the bathroom. I don't know. This has got to, they have sworn to me this is the last day that they're going to be here. I pray to God, because I don't know what you guys can hear, but there is always chaos going on around me here. Okay, let's just kind of pretend that everything is okay. And that there aren't a bunch of thieves up there stealing my record collection. I really, honestly, I don't give a rat's ass about anything else. Just don't take my dog and don't take my record collection. Everything else you can have. Okay, so the loanable funds market and interest rates. So we want to talk more here about how does borrowing and lending work. And also, what determines interest rates? If you follow the news, if you follow business and economics news, of course, every day it's like, interest rates are going up, interest rates are going down, they're moving this way, they're moving that way. Future interest rates are rising, right? Well, we got to have a framework for thinking about, well, what is it exactly that determines interest rates? And honestly, what is interest rates, and how do interest rates impact the market for borrowing and lending? And so we're going to do that through a little model here, and we're going to call this the loanable funds market. And the loanable funds market is just an application of supply and demand. Right? It's just an application of supply and demand, but here, instead of talking about, once again, the demand and supply for cat stickers, we're going to talk about the demand and supply for loanable funds. basically meaning borrowing and lending. Okay. What determines the supply of loanable funds? How much money out there is available to be borrowed? Well, as we've talked about, that's what we call savings. Savings is the supply of loanable funds, right? When people postpone consumption, when they don't consume, but they want to put off their consumption, that creates a supply of money that's available to be lent. So the supply of loanable funds is really based on the amount of savings. What determines the demand for loanable funds? That is determined by investment, right? So as we've talked about, it's typically households who save that creates the supply of loanable funds. And it's firms who do the investment purchasing that create the demand for loanable funds. And then we have a price of borrowing loanable funds. And what do we call that price of borrowing loanable funds? That's the interest rate. An interest rate is just a price. It's just a price. It's a different kind of price, right? We give it a different name than a price, but it is a price. It's the price of borrowing money. It's the price of getting a loanable funds today when you need them. So we can think about a loanable funds market here as just once again, a simple application of supply and demand, where we have the demand for loanable funds, which we'll call investment, right? And we have a supply of loanable funds, which we call savings. And we have, oops, wrong. We have an interest rate here. And then we have a quantity of loanable funds. What interest rate are we talking about? If you remember yesterday, we talked about nominal interest rates and real interest rates. Which interest rate really matters when it comes to saving and investment? Do you think Sunny says real with a question mark? Real? Get rid of that question mark, Sunny, right? Confidence. Yes, real interest rates. It's the real interest rate that matters, right? We don't want to be confused by inflation, right? It's the real interest rate that matters. And so in this loanable funds market, it should be basically the equilibrium between savings and investment that determines the real interest rate. In other words, the real interest rate adjusts so that savings equals investment. And the market clears, right? So the real interest rate or the price adjusts so that savings equals investment. So once again, this is just supply and demand. This is really the same stuff we talked about on Monday. Really, the only thing that kind of makes it a little confusing is that now we've kind of changed the names of everything, right? Instead of calling it, supply, we're really thinking about savings. Instead of talking about demand, we're really thinking about investment. Instead of talking about a price, we're calling that price the interest rate. But really, it's the same kind of applications, right? We have a investment curve, a savings curve, and a real interest rate. So Sunny asks, is the interest rate is too low when the economy is doing well and is too high when the economy is doing bad? Let's hold on to this question, right? But one of the things we want to avoid when we think about prices is thinking about them as being too low or too high. In a perfectly competitive market, they are what they are, right? They reflect supply and demand. And so in this model, interest rates are going to reflect what savings and investment are. And so what's going to determine interest rates? They're going to be determined by savings and investment. And so if we want to think about the things that shift, or I'm sorry, if we want to think about the things that determine interest rates, we've got to think about the things that change savings and change investment. So let's talk about this. Let's begin by talking about savings. What kind of things could shift the savings curve and change interest rates? Well, a lot of things, okay, a lot of things, but I want to kind of focus on 3 things here that play a big role in determining what savings are in an economy, and as a result, play a big role in determining interest rates. The first is policies that impact savings rates. Government policies that impact private savings. One of the things that we observe across the globe is that there are big differences in savings rates in different countries. If you look at the savings rate in Germany, it's about 20% of GDP, right? They save about 20% of GDP in Germany. China saves about 30 to 40% of GDP, as best as we can measure. What's our savings rate in the US? Typically 2%. We are not a country of savers. We are not a country of savers. And as a result, if you think about this, what's the impact of low savings in the US? This drives up interest rates. Because the fact that our savings rate, like let's say this is in the US relative to Germany, mean that interest rates should be lower in the US. I'm sorry, interest rates should be lower in Germany than they are in the US, because the US saves much less than Germany does. That should lead to higher interest rates. Why is it that Germans save so much more? Well, listen, there's a lot of factors that go into this. Some of it is tax policy, which we're going to get back to it in a second, or talk about here in a second. Some of it is just simply preference, right? I mean, we definitely know that some countries seem to have more of a desire to save than other countries, right? And so Germans are kind of, well known for their frugality, right? Of being a country in which savings is kind of culturally very important. I don't think that many Americans are known for their frugality, right? Other than me. So yeah, sometimes there could be cultural reasons, right, that kind of influence people's preferences. But definitely one of the things that plays a big role is tax policy. The US is very much an outlier in terms of the structure of our tax system. In the US, we primarily rely on an income tax system. An income tax system basically means that we tax income. But most of the world, including Canada, Europe, right? Honestly, most of the world do not rely on a system that primarily taxes income. They tend to rely on consumption-based tax systems. For those of you who've been spent time in Canada or Europe, you might have heard of the VAT tax, the VAT, which is kind of, this is short for the value added tax. But this is essentially a tax in the price of goods. So when you go to Europe and you go out to eat, like let's say you've spent 20 euros on a lunch, when you get your receipt, you'll actually see that in that receipt of the 20 euros you spent, maybe 3 of them went to VAT taxes. So they're taxes that are essentially put in the price of goods that firms have to pay. But it is essentially a consumption tax. It's a consumption tax. So when you tax consumption, what does that encourage you to do? Save, right? It encourages you to save, right? And that's part of the idea. As opposed to what about when you tax income? Income is actually a tax on savings, because what happens when you save? Hopefully you'll earn a return, but that return gets taxed under an income-based tax system. So many economists actually argue that if you were serious about encouraging more savings, if you were serious about reducing the trade deficit, taxing consumption would be a good idea. So there have been proposals floated by economists for things like a national consumption tax. What would that look like? It would basically be a consumption tax that you'd pay on everything you bought. How big would that consumption tax be? It would probably have to be around 30%. Okay, now a few of you might have just felt your heart stop, right? You'd have to spend 30% more on everything that you bought. But remember, your income, your take-home income is going to go up because you wouldn't pay an income tax, right? So you would not pay an income tax, but you would pay a much bigger consumption tax, right? Logan asked, what's the difference between a sales tax and a consumption tax? Well, a sales tax is a kind of consumption tax. It's a kind of consumption tax. So, you might imagine how you feel about that, paying 30% more for everything, but having more take-home pay. But you can see what kind of incentive it creates, right? It creates a pretty big incentive not to spend money. And so if the US was really serious about saving more, a consumption-based tax system would make a lot of sense, right? It would make a lot of sense. So definitely our tax system is one of the things that can shift savings.
I have a question real quick. Does that, because so our tax system right now, right, like it goes based on, like you said, income, and like if you make within a certain amount, you're only taxed like 10% or whatever. So I guess my question with the VAT tax is, do we see that like disproportionately affecting lower income families?
So that's a good question. And yes, there is the danger of consumption-based taxes disproportionately affecting poor families, because poor people tend to spend a bigger fraction of their income than rich people do, right? Rich people have more flexibility to save. And so usually how countries deal with that is a couple of ways. First off, not all goods get taxed at the same rate. So, for instance, luxury goods tend to get taxed at a higher rate than just food would. And then the other way is many countries do have income taxes, but they only impact people at very high levels of income. So for instance, France does have an income-based tax system, but it's just paid by a relatively small percentage of the population. Yeah. And so Sunny says, yeah, in Pakistan, the government taxes foreign cars at about 100 or 150%, right? So yeah, in some sense, like a tariff, like an import tariff is a form of a consumption tax, right? It is a form of a consumption tax. Really quickly here, because we should take a break. Let's just talk really quickly about a couple of other things that could shift savings. Changes in wealth, right? Obviously, if the wealth of your country goes up, you can save more. And in terms of our model, an increase in savings would actually reduce interest rates. So interestingly enough, richer countries should have lower interest rates. Wealthier countries should have lower interest rates. And then business cycles, recessions tend to play a big role in the amount of savings. We have certainly seen this during COVID. What's happened to the US savings rate? Going way up, right? People have saved a lot of money during the COVID. Why has savings gone up? Well, for a couple of reasons. One is sometimes people couldn't spend their money, right? I mean, when we were in lockdown, there were a lot fewer opportunities to go shopping or to go out to eat or to go to see movies. But then part of it is also this fear factor, right? And sometimes economists call this precautionary savings. So when people were worried about the economic impact of COVID and they're worried about losing their job, they just started to save more, right? And so certainly we have seen that during the COVID era. One of the reasons why interest rates have fallen is because we're saving more, right? Now, how long that's going to last? Well, we're Americans. I doubt very long. But yeah, but you know, we definitely have seen precautionary savings go up during COVID. Okay, let's take a very quick break. And I want to come back and then let's talk about some things that shift the demand curve. And then I also want to talk a little bit about kind of just some basic information about the US financial market, okay? So we'll take about a 5-minute break, okay? And we'll meet back here in 5 minutes. All right, everybody. Here we go. Let's take a little bit of break from our discussion of the financial system and let's go back and let's talk about quiz number 2, okay? I think that most of you have been able to get responses for the baseball players who took the Mace Cup quiz. I'll have to be able to give you your responses, or I'll look at your quiz here later this afternoon. Like I said, I got kind of a long series of meetings today, which is very frustrating, but I'll get you a response later in today. But I did want to kind of spend a couple of minutes here going over quiz number 2 and make sure that we all kind of know why we got the grade we did, so that if we want to review some of this stuff this weekend, we'll do that. So let me pull up quiz number 2. Oops, that's not quiz number 2. Here we go. Okay. So please take notes on this. particularly if you haven't gotten your graded quiz back yet. So what components of GDP are affected by the following transactions? A share of stock issued by Apple is sold for $1,000 with a commission of $50. The answer here is consumption, $50. Remember that financial transactions are not included in GDP because nothing is produced, right? Nothing is produced. So just giving Apple money is a financial transaction, but it's not included in GDP. However, the service provided by the broker who charges you the $50 commission, that is included in GDP and it'd be included in consumption. B, a tractor is bought from China for $400,000. That would be an import of $400,000. That would impact imports. And C, Dell spends $300,000 on computer chip research. That would be investment of $300,000. Define the terms real and nominal. Real means adjusted for inflation or measured in constant prices. Nominal means not adjusted for inflation or measured in current prices. Is unemployment real or nominal? Unemployment is real, right? Because it's not measured in prices at all, right? So by definition, it's measured in constant prices. Okay, question number 3 here. Use the following information to fill in the table. So I am not going to work through this. We've worked through this kind of problem a couple of times in class. I'm going to give you the answer, and if you struggled with getting this or if you made a mistake, you need to go back and do this yourself this weekend and figure out where your mistake came from, okay? So I'm just going to give you the answer. You're going to have to spend some time to go back and try to figure out what went wrong, because for me doing this for you again is probably not useful. So you should find that nominal GDP in 2007 was 220, in 2008 was 364, in 2009 was 470. Real GDP was 390, 480, and 470, right? And remember, 2009 is our base year. And then what's the aggregate price index, or the GDP deflator? This is nominal divided by real times 100. So this was 56.4, 75.8, and 100. What then is inflation between 07 and 08? You just take the percent change in the aggregate price index between 07 and 08. So this would be 75.8 minus 56.4 divided by 56.4 times 100, or 35.1%. What was the real growth rate between 2008 and 2009? To get the real growth rate, we have to use real GDP. So we need to figure out the real GDP between 2008 and 2009. So what was real GDP in 2008? 470. What was real GDP in 2007? 480. And you should get -2%, right? Because GDP was actually lower in 2008 than 2007. Okay. This is exactly the kind of question you're very likely to see on the exam on Tuesday. I don't feel like I'm giving away anything here by saying that, right? So these kind of questions are a consumer price index question. Absolutely, you'll see something like this. So if you struggled with this, there were some mistakes in calculating real GDP. I think a couple of us are still getting a little confused about how to calculate growth rates. So this is the kind of thing we definitely want to spend some time cleaning up this weekend, right? Cleaning up this weekend. Sunny says you're getting 34.4 for the inflation rate. Are you dividing by 56.4? Right? Are you using 75.8? Are you rounding? That could be a rounding error. Okay, and then finally, the comparative advantage problem. Okay. Once again, I think we've done this a couple of times in class. Actually, I'm not even going to show this. Sorry. So once again, I just want to give you the answer here for the comparative advantage problem. And I want you to work through it by yourself, right? See if you can figure out why you got the answer you did. If not, talk to a classmate. You can talk to me. I'm more than happy to help you. But I think at this point, it probably would make the most sense for you to work through this yourself. But what you should find is when you calculate the opportunity cost of a US book, you should see that it's 5/9 of a TV. And what's the opportunity cost of a Chinese book? 3/8 of a TV. Which one is lower? China. So China has comparative advantage in books. What price should books sell at? They should sell between the two opportunity costs, between 3/8 of a TV and 5/9 of a TV. So a somewhat common mistake here, maybe, or let me put it this way, not a common, because I think a number of us did this problem just fine, but probably the most common mistake was just getting our opportunity costs backwards, right? Remember, opportunity cost is what you give up relative to what you get. And I think a number of us got the opportunity costs wrong. And so when you flip it upside down, when you get it backwards, you're going to get everything wrong, right? And so for those of you who did that, I did give you some partial credit, but you got to make sure that you get the opportunity cost right? If you get it backwards, you're going to get completely the wrong answers. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about that? All right, so good. So let's right now return back to our previously scheduled programming here and talk about our loanable funds market. And let's go back to this question about things that shift investment demand. Because these are also things that are going to impact interest rates. The things that shift investment demand. I'm going to talk about three things here once again. Actually, I'm going to talk about two things. The productivity of investment. Okay, what happens if there's some sort of innovation? Well, innovation is one of the things that could potentially drive up interest rates because it's going to impact our investment curve. So here we have a new technology, right? And this new technology, firms need to invest in it, right? So let's say that there's some new piece of communication technology, such as 5G, right? All of you have probably seen commercials for 5G, right? So is this new technology that it's going to improve the speed of our cell phones? What, of course, have cell phone companies had to do? They've had to spend a lot of money in investing in new towers and all the new equipment. What's that going to do? That's going to drive up the demand for investment. It should increase interest rates. Second, Business cycles don't just impact savings, they also impact investment. Business cycles often get impacted by investment, and in part because they reflect expectations of the future. Once again, think about COVID. If you were a CEO of a big firm and you had a number of investment projects that you were going to invest in, when COVID hit, what do you think you did to the planning for all those investment projects? You probably put the hold on them, right? Because who knows what's going to happen in the future? You don't know what's going to happen to your profits. You might have to just discontinue some of your investment projects, right? And so certainly, one of the things that many firms did was they paused their investment projects. So Sonny says if he was a CEO, he'd fire 20,000 workers and continue with the investments. Well, maybe you might do both, right? But yeah, a lot of firms pause their investments. One of the things that we know about business cycles is that of all of those components of GDP, the most volatile, meaning the one that goes up and down the most, is investment. During good times, investment tends to boom. During bad times, investment tends to bust. Investment is very much subject to the boom and bust cycle. And so we're going to talk about this more as we move through the class, and particularly when we talk about theories of business cycles. We're going to talk about an economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes, probably the most famous macroeconomist of all time, who has a very influential theory about why business cycles take place. But a lot of Keynes's theory is based upon this idea that business cycles are driven by boom-bust cycles. And these boom-bust cycles are basically driven by psychology. By psychology. Keynes refers to them as the animal spirits of our thinking. And what he's really trying to say here by calling it animal spirits is he's really saying that people are very volatile. They make decisions sometimes in very irrational ways, and they're subject to boom-bust thinking. And so what happens during good times? Buy, spend. And then what happens during bad times? Disaster. Cut your spending, slash your spending, save, right? And so Keynes really sees a lot of the reason why we have business cycles as really closely tied to psychology. And so, like I said, we're going to talk about this later in the class when we talk about business cycles, but talking about Keynes and the reasons why he thinks psychology is plays such a big role in business cycles is going to be one of the big things that we talk about. Okay. In our discussion so far, have you noticed something about all these curves, right? Like this curve here of their loanable funds market? There's an assumption that we've made here that I never really made clear. This is a closed economy. Savings equals investment, but only in a closed economy. What about an open economy? Do we get the same sort of stuff? What if we look at the global market for loanable funds? Not just think about the US market for loanable funds, but think about global markets, because increasingly financial markets are global. it's not just Americans who save in the US financial market, it's people from all over the world. And likewise, Americans will save and invest in many different kind of markets. How do we think about this? Well, one way you could think about this is that interest rates are determined by global savings and global investment. So think about, I'm going to draw this here, a smaller graph over to the left. But our global loanable funds market, where we have savings for the world and investment for the world, and that determines the world interest rate. Now, what about a country like the US? Let's just think about the US loanable funds market. What's going to be true about interest rates? Actually, can I change this example? Because I really shouldn't use the US example. The US, in some ways, the US is the globe. It's hard to separate the global market from the US market because the US is so big. So let's change our example here. Let's think about a smaller economy. Let's talk about Canada, right? Let's talk about Canada. Canada is a small part of the world market. I'm sorry if there's any Canadians out there. I don't mean to insult you, but you are unimportant. So Canada, right? What happens if savings and investment look like this in Canada? What's going to be true in Canada? For Canada, at that world interest rate, saving is going to be less than investment. Because the world interest rate is actually lower than what interest rates would be if they were just closed. What does this mean? It means, using that equation that we talked about before, that Canada is going to run a trade deficit. So in a global economy, world interest rates are more determined by global conditions than by domestic conditions. And so as a result, you can run a trade deficit or a trade surplus, right? In this case, this is what Canada is doing. This is also very probably similar to what the situation in the US is, right? That interest rates are kept low in the US in part because we're part of a global economy. Right? In a global economy, that actually in the US's case keeps interest rates lower than what they would be if we were just in a closed economy. Because if we were in a closed economy, savings would have to equal investment, and because of our low savings rates, interest rates would have to jump, right? But because we're part of a global economy, in our case, that actually keeps interest rates lower than they would be. And so I keep on saying this, but we will come back and touch on these issues more as we go through class, because one of the things that we see is that, the U.S. is benefited greatly by the fact that we are such an attractive place for many countries to save their money. U.S. financial markets are extremely attractive to foreign investors. And that's one of the reasons why interest rates in the U.S. right now, and have been for the last 10 or 15 years, are so low. The U.S. has some of the lowest interest rates in the world. Instead of turning off investors, that actually attracts them, right? They're actually attracted because the U.S. is seen as a safe place with big markets, right? Where they can put their money into them and invest safely. So the global economy, at least in the U.S.'s case, is one of the things that keeps interest rates low. I want to talk about one other thing about interest rates before we move on to another topic. And this is something we talked about yesterday. And that's inflation. So yesterday we talked about the distinction between the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate. And the difference between these two is expected inflation. So which interest rates have we been talking about here this morning? Whoa. Damn it. Technical difficulties. Sorry. For some reason, my Apple Pen is not working. Well, damn it. Screws up all my great plans. Okay. Luckily, one of my kids has another knockoff Apple Pen. Hold on for a moment. Let me go see if I can find it. Maybe that will work. Apologize. Talk amongst yourself here for a minute.
Hey, Stallman.
Fuck you, Konasek.
Okay. Of course, this is not going to be able to sync up. Sorry, everybody. To think that we could have gone an entire week without some sort of massive technical failing, which would have been just way, way, way too much to hope for. So, at least in my experience. Oh, God damn it. Now it's working. What in the hell? Okay. I have no idea why it stopped working or why it's working now. All right. Sorry. So anyway, back to what we were talking about. This is what we talked about yesterday, right? That we have been really this morning talking about the real interest rate. That's kind of been the focus of our discussion. But it's important to remember that the interest rates that you usually see in the paper are nominal interest rates, which are adjusted. You take the real interest rate and you add to it the expected inflation rate. And so we should be aware of something that's called the Fisher effect. The Fisher effect is named after a famous economist, Irving Fisher. who was really the first to kind of recognize that there is a distinction between real and nominal interest rates. And so the Fisher effect simply says a 1% increase in expected inflation should increase nominal interest rates by 1%. A 1% increase in expected inflation should increase nominal interest rates by also 1%. In other words, there should be a one-to-one relationship here between the two. In other words, this equation should hold. If expected inflation goes up by 1%, we would expect to see nominal interest rates go up by 1%. That's what the Fisher effect says. Do we in fact see such a close relationship? Do we in fact see such a close relationship between inflation and interest rates? And the answer is yes, but there's a caveat here. Okay, there's a caveat. And so let's actually look at some data, and then we'll talk about what that caveat is. All right. So here, let's look first on this graph here at the left. The purple line is the inflation rate, and the green line is the 10-year Treasury constant maturity rate, interest rate, right? So it's basically the interest rate on a Treasury bond. Is there a one-to-one relationship between these two things? Well, yes, but you'll notice it's not perfect. It's not perfect. Over the long term, yes, a 1% increase in inflation leads to a 1% increase in the interest rate. But these relations are not perfect. If you look here on the graph on the right, once again, you see a relationship between the interest rate and inflation, but they don't always move perfectly together. Who can help me out? Why isn't the interest rate, the nominal interest rate, and the inflation rate moving perfectly together? Why would that be? And think about what we talked about yesterday. I think that should help you. What's the inflation rate here that Fisher's talking about? What's the interest rate that we have here, Zach? Zach Stallman.
Are you talking about like what kind of interest rate?
Right. So yeah, or what kind of inflation rate? Let me show you my screen again. It's going to pop up here, right? In this Fisher effect, what kind of inflation rate is this?
Would that be the real inflation rate, or is the expected inflation rate?
Expected inflation rate, right? Fisher effect says that if there's a 1% increase in expected inflation, then the interest rate should go up by 1%. But in that graph that I just showed you, what's the inflation rate that was used there? The actual inflation rate. In other words, what's the difference between what we're talking about here in this equation and what we saw in the data? One is talking about expected, and one is talking about actual. But does actual always equal expected when it comes to inflation? No. No, and this is the problem of unexpected inflation that we talked about yesterday, right? That problem of unexpected inflation. So if we go back and look at this, if we look at these graphs, why isn't the interest rate moving exactly with the inflation rate? Because sometimes that inflation was unexpected, right? Sometimes that inflation was unexpected. It was not anticipated by markets. And particularly, if you can look at the left-hand side graph there, look what happened in the 1970s, right? Remember that example I talked about my mom and dad buying that 20-year mortgage where they locked into interest rates, and then what happened to inflation? It went up quite unexpectedly. And so you can see that interest rates rose during the 1970s, but not nearly as much as inflation rose because markets were surprised by it. They were surprised. And then you see in the 1980s that inflation fell dramatically, but that interest rates didn't fall as dramatically because, once again, markets were surprised by the fall in inflation. So markets got fooled on both ends of this, right? They got fooled on both ends of this. And you can see on the right-hand side graph, other occasions where markets got fooled. For instance, look at what happened in 2008 and 2009. When inflation actually was negative in 2009. We had negative inflation in 2009. Inflation fell quite dramatically during the global financial crisis. Interest rates fell too, but they didn't fall nearly that fast. Once again, markets were surprised, right? Markets were surprised by that. So I just wanted to talk about this because this really reemphasizes something that we talked about yesterday, is that oftentimes it's not inflation that matters the most, it's unexpected inflation. Unexpected inflation is what creates winners and losers, what can cause people to gain money or can cause people to lose a lot of money. And it's unexpected inflation that can kill your financial system because it will leave banks and savers with big losses. And so, they will be reluctant to lend again, right? I think that's one of the things that we've learned over years is that there's no better way to kill your financial system than to have unexpected inflation. So, right, that's the other important thing to remember about inflation is that while we've talked a lot about this morning about real interest rates, it's really important to remember that nominal interest rates matter too, and that has to do with inflation, right? Okay, so does that kind of make sense to everybody, right? And that kind of connects this discussion here this morning to what we talked about yesterday, right? So now we have kind of hopefully we have a better understanding of some of the factors that play a role in interest rates. We've talked about things that impact savings, such as wealth, and we've talked about risk in the business cycle. We've talked about things that impact investment, such as the business cycle, and expectations. We've also talked about the relationship between expected inflation, actual inflation, and interest rates, right? So there's kind of our introductory discussion about interest rates. Okay, there's one last thing here I want to do this morning, and that's kind of changed gears a little bit and talk about the US financial system. Just kind of do a more descriptive talk about the US financial system. Now, I'm not going to go into this in nearly as much detail as your book does. Okay? A lot of this is just descriptive. And so you can read this as well as I can tell it to you. So I do want to kind of touch on a couple of things about the US financial system to kind of highlight, but I would very much encourage you to spend some time reading your book because I'm not going to go into this as much detail as your book does in part because of time constraints. Particularly those of you who don't have a lot of background in finance, right? If you're somebody who's never really followed the financial market or don't really know what a bond or a stock is, or if this is all kind of a black box to you, then I would definitely encourage that you read this section of the book more carefully. But here I'm just going to kind of hit a couple of highlights, right? And so when you think about the US financial system, really the US financial system has four big parts. Four big things. There is the bond market. There is the stock market. There are financial intermediaries. This includes things like banks, insurance companies, and mutual funds. And then there's the foreign exchange market. Where we trade currencies. So our financial system can really be broken into four big parts. Quite honestly, we could spend an entire, well, more than one block talking about any one of these four parts, right? For instance, for those of you who take money and banking from me in ECB 225, we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about each of these parts. Particularly, we'll spend a lot of time talking about banking, right? We'll talk about how financial intermediaries, particularly banks, work. And we'll spend more time talking about the bond market. For those of you who are interested in investments or the stock market, you can take a course like investments that has probably more focus on the bond market and the stock market. In a lot of your macroeconomic courses, we'll talk about the foreign exchange market. In fact, later in this class, we'll talk about the foreign exchange market. So there's a lot to be said about any one of these, but I do just, in a couple of minutes that we have left, just kind of do a brief introduction to each of these big parts, or at least to the first three. I'm not going to say much about foreign exchange markets, but we will, at the end of class, come back and talk more about foreign exchange markets. But let's talk about each of these. The bond market. If I asked you what's bigger, the bond market or the stock market, what would you say? Anybody's got a
Bond.
guess? What?
Bond.
Bond, right? And you knew it was bond because everybody thinks it's the stock market. So the fact I asked you which of it is, you knew it was the bond market, right? And that's true. That's exactly why I asked you. The bond market in the US is about twice as big as the stock market. So you want to talk about the biggest form of finance in the US, it's actually the US bond market, which is the biggest in the world. And so this is where people can directly borrow from the public. What is a bond? What makes a bond a bond? Well, a bond, you remember how we defined finance at the beginning of class? That finance is trading money across time with conditions attached. So what is a bond? A bond is defined by the conditions that are attached to the lending of money, okay? So every bond has four features. It has on it the name of the borrower. In other words, who's going to pay. It has on it the maturity date in which you repay. It has what's called the face value. Meaning the amount that you repay at maturity. And then it has a stated nominal interest rate. So it might be a $10,000 bond that lasts 5 years and pays 2%. Okay. So what makes a bond, in many ways, a bond, is that many of the terms of borrowing are fixed. Now, here's the question. Let's say that I bought a $10,000, I bought a government bond that had a face value of $10,000 and was paying 2%. Do I pay $10,000 for that bond? Not necessarily. I could pay more for it. I could pay less for it. If I pay less than $10,000, that's going to increase the return to my bond. And if I pay more, that's going to reduce the return to my bond. Okay? So the face value is the amount that you get at the end. It's not the same thing as the price, right? So let's just make that clear, right? That the price is not the same thing as the face value. You can pay any price for a bond, but that face value, the amount that you get at the end, is predetermined. Four types of bonds, right? There's really 4 different types of bonds that people can buy. The first is what are called treasury bonds, and these are issued by the federal government. A bond, a treasury bond, has a maturity of greater than 1 year. And what's called a treasury bill has a maturity of less than 1 year. Okay, so you'll hear of treasury bonds or treasury bills. Really, the distinction is just how long that they last. The huge attraction of treasury bonds and treasury bills to most savers is that they are very liquid, meaning these are very, very easy to sell. These are some of the most liquid assets in the world. So if you have $1 million or $10 million and you need to stash it someplace for a short period of time, putting it in a treasury bill or treasury bond is a very, very good place to do it. These are also very attractive because they are as close as you can get to risk-free. And I put risk-free in parentheses because nothing in life is risk-free. But they're probably in the financial world as close as you can get to risk-free as possible. Why are they risk-free? There's a simple answer. The government owns the printing press, right? So could the federal government pay off all its bonds tomorrow? Well, maybe not literally tomorrow, but yeah, the federal government could turn on the printing press and print up $21 trillion of money and pay off all their bonds if they wanted, right? So in that sense, there should be no chance that the federal government ever defaulted on these bonds because they can print up as much money as they want. Now, of course, there's other risks associated with that. But, you know, in terms of default, right, there's very, very little chance that the government would actually default on these. And so treasury bonds are really attractive, and you can see why, right? They're safe. They're safe, and there's a lot of them. Then there's municipal bonds. These are the bonds issued by state and local governments. But it's important to note that these things are not always liquid, right? So when the Mount Vernon school system issues a bond to build a new basketball court, you know, that's not the most liquid thing in the world because most people don't even know where Mount Vernon is, let alone whether their school system is going to pay the money back. These are also not risk-free. Because can state and local governments default on their bonds? Sure, ask the people who hold bonds of Detroit, right? Or Orange County, right? Or Puerto Rico, right? I mean, state and local governments can default on their bonds. And so, you know, unlike the treasury bonds, these things can have a fair amount of risk associated with them. Corporate bonds. These are the bonds that are issued by corporations. And there's a lot to be said here. I won't say it other than many, many different types of corporations can issue many, many different types of bonds. But this is a common way for many, many of the bigger corporations to borrow money. And then finally, and this one will take a little bit of explaining, there are what we call securitized bonds. These are bonds that are backed by other assets. Bonds that are backed by other assets. For instance, mortgage-backed security bonds, right, are often called MBS. What in the world is a mortgage-backed security bond? So let's talk about this, because I think this is really important to understand, not just from the perspective of understanding how finance works, but when we talk about the global financial crisis in 2008, you have to understand how mortgage-backed security bonds worked, or you can't really understand what went on during the crisis of 2008. So let me first begin by talking about a mortgage. All your parents probably have a mortgage. I doubt any of you have a mortgage. But how does a mortgage work? Well, in the old days, meaning like back in the 1970s, well before you guys were born, what would happen if you wanted a mortgage to buy your house? You went to the local bank and you said, I want to buy my house, or I want to buy this house. The bank said, sure, we will lend you money for 30 years. Here's what you pay us every month. And what would you do? You just send that check to the bank every month, and the bank would just take your checks, and that was it, right? It was a very, very boring business, right? A very, very boring business. Part of the problem with this kind of setup, though, was many people in many parts of the country had a very difficult time of getting a mortgage, right? Because if you didn't have a bank that could lend you near, didn't know you, didn't know where your house was, what was happening to the real estate market, it was really hard to get a mortgage. Also, in the old days, you would have to put like 20 or 30% down. So whatever the house cost, you'd have to put a big chunk of it down to be able to buy the house, and you had to pay a high interest rate. So it was very kind of let's say not particularly, it was a mortgage market that wasn't really consumer friendly. Well, that is till the geniuses and on Wall Street got involved in this. And I don't mean this completely sarcastically, because this was a genius idea. It was legitimately a genius idea. The guys at Wall Street said, well, what's the problem here? The problem is that mortgages are illiquid. And they're illiquid because every mortgage is different, right? Every mortgage has a weird price. It has a different interest rate. You have mortgages in Mount Vernon, Iowa. Who the hell knows what's going on in Mount Vernon, Iowa? I have no idea what a house looks like in Mount Vernon. They may just live in barns there for all we know, right? So most people don't want to buy mortgages because there's too much information that you don't know about an individual mortgage. But what the guys on Wall Street said is, well, that's true about one mortgage. But what happens if I buy 200,000 mortgages? Now I've got an idea. Because if I buy 200,000 mortgages, I can use the law of large numbers and I can say something much more concrete about what the risk of 200,000 mortgages is. I actually understand the risk of 200,000 mortgages more than I do the risk of one mortgage. But how in the world do I buy 200,000 mortgages? Well, I issue bonds. I issue bonds, raise a lot of money, use that money to buy mortgages, and then how do I pay interest on the bonds? When people pay me their mortgage interest, I then pay the interest on the bond. And of course, I keep some from profit, right? And so that is essentially what a mortgage-backed bond is. What you've essentially done is you've turned a mortgage, which is illiquid and not very easy to sell, into a bond, which was liquid and very attractive to investors. These things boomed. You could not sell these mortgage-backed bonds fast enough. Investors love them. They love them so much that what became the real constraint? The constraint was not how many bonds we could sell, but how many mortgages we could buy. And that is essentially what happened during the global financial crisis, is when the demand for these bonds got so big, the demand for mortgages got so big that all of a sudden anybody could qualify for a mortgage. And pretty much everybody did qualify for mortgage. And so what happened in 2008, when many of these mortgages started to default, and when housing prices started to go down, right? Because housing prices had been inflated by everybody being able to now buy a house. So when people began to see the risk associated with these things, the bond market dried up. People didn't want to buy the bonds, meaning that now people didn't want to buy the mortgages, meaning now people couldn't buy houses, meaning housing prices started to fall, meaning now people could not make the payment on their mortgages, meaning now you couldn't make the payment on the bonds. This whole thing fell apart, right? And it fell apart very suddenly and dramatically with huge losses to the financial system. We'll talk more about this process a little bit later, right? But this is a good example of how things in finance can be a great idea. And this was an idea that improved the life of millions of people, but it also almost fundamentally wrecked the economy, right? It's all about risk, right? It's all about risk. And certainly you can have too much of a good thing. And that was definitely the thing with securitized bonds. Unlike what you tend to think about, bonds are risky. Many people have this idea that bonds are somehow not risky, but bonds are risky. There's default risk, right? That the company will default, or the state and local government will default. There's what we call interest rate risk. Higher interest rates make existing bonds less attractive. So their price falls. So you can actually lose money on a bond. If you're holding a bond and interest rates go up, the bond that you have that pays lower interest rates is going to become less attractive, right? And so you could lose money, right? You could lose money. That's a very big risk of bonds. There's inflation risk. That higher inflation could eat away at the real value of your bond. And that there's finally liquidity risk. Can you sell it? Sometimes it's just become, particularly during a stock market crash, you can find it impossible to actually sell your bonds, right? When the market dries up, you may not be able to sell it, particularly when you need it the most. All right, we really are going over here, so I'm going to just be extremely brief about these other two parts of the U.S. financial system. I wanted to talk about bonds more because I think bonds are probably something that we have less familiarity with. Let's just talk quickly about the stock market. And like I said, you really should read this part of the book, particularly if you're a person that doesn't really have a lot of financial literacy, right? What is a stock? Well, once again, stock is trading money across time with conditions attached. What are the conditions? The most important condition of a stock, and the reason we have stocks, fundamentally, is limited liability. If you buy a share of Apple and then Apple does something horrid, right? Can the person that Apple does something horrid to turn around and sue you? No, you are only invested to the extent that you've bought the stock, right? They cannot sue you individually. And so limited liability is actually the fundamental reason why we have corporations and stocks. But of course, to get limited liability, you also have limited control. You basically get to vote for the board of directors. So you don't get to tell Apple what they do or don't do if you own a share of Apple. The only thing you get is one vote on the board. You also get limited ownership. If you buy a share of Apple, can you just go into an Apple store and put an iPhone in your pocket and say, don't worry about it, I own this place? No, right? It doesn't work like that. Basically, what limited ownership means is you get a share of any dividends. If the company pays you dividends, meaning pays its owners any money, you get your share. But that's really all ownership means. It doesn't mean much more than that. So stock market is all about limited. You get limited liability, but you also have limited control, limited ownership. And of course, these things can be sold on markets. And so, markets are you can buy and sell these things. Zach asked, we don't have control when Elon Musk gets on Twitter and says his stock price is too high. Yeah, you don't have really control over anything. Now, Elon Musk does have a lot of control over Tesla, but that's because he owns more than 50% of the shares, right? He alone gets more than 50% of the vote. So yeah, if you own enough of a company, you can have control. But of course, even for Elon Musk, his control is limited to some extent, right? He doesn't get 100% say. And, depending on how much you own, that can significantly limit what you want to do. Can you believe my pen isn't working again? All right. Let me just flash up some notes here for the last thing I want to talk about. The last thing I wanted to talk about here this morning in terms of our financial system is financial intermediaries. These include banks. Okay. What does a bank do? Banks really specialize in small savers and small borrowers. So the key business for a bank is the word small, right? They tend to work with households and small businesses. So people that have small amount of savings, they help them provide checking accounts and savings accounts. A small firm that wants to borrow money, that's where a bank helps them, right? if you wanted to start a coffee shop in Mount Vernon and you needed $50,000, could you go to Wall Street and issue shares of stock? No, because on Wall Street they couldn't even care. I mean, if they saw $50,000 laying on the ground, they may not even bend over to pick it up, right? I mean, they're into the millions and billions. So what do small savers and small borrowers do? They go to a bank, right? They go to a bank, and banks help reduce transaction costs. They help to kind of fill in these gaps. Likewise, a mutual fund. A mutual fund is really a kind of bank. It is a kind of bank where a mutual fund takes small deposits. But what do they do with those small deposits? Instead of like at a bank where they would lend it out to small firms, what a mutual fund does is they buy a portfolio of assets. So they'll buy a bunch of stocks and bonds. And this is hugely popular for savers because it allows you to invest in markets at very low cost, and you can get diversified, and you can use somebody else's expertise, right? And so mutual funds are a growing in importance way of savings, as they should be. It is a great way. It is really the way that 99% of investors, maybe 100% of investors should be saving, is through a mutual fund, because it really allows you all the advantages of diversification, and it's easy. So like I have this table here, but like here's an example of just this is just a small example, but what one mutual fund might have. They might take the money in the mutual fund, and in 5% they put in Microsoft, 4% in Apple, 3% in Amazon, 1% in Facebook, right? And just go on and on down the line, holding hundreds, if not thousands of different companies, right? That allows you the benefits of diversification, and it allows small savers to get into the financial markets. And so this could be stock, or this could be bonds, or there's also mutual funds that hold real estate. There's mutual funds that hold basically any sort of financial asset, right? Any sort of financial asset. Logan asks, what's a 401k? A 401k is a tax savings plan that you can put the money that you put in that into a mutual fund. Okay, so in other words, a 401k is a way that you can put tax exempt money into a mutual fund. So you're right, it is related to a mutual fund, but the 401k specifically refers to a tax plan in which you can do that. And so when you get your jobs, most of you will have a 401k plan, which allows you to put money pre-tax into a mutual fund. And you should definitely take advantage of that because that is for most people, that is the best way to save. Finally, there's pension companies and insurance companies, right? And they basically do the same thing. People give them premiums, and then what do they do with the premiums? They invest those premiums with an eye towards that they're going to have to make payouts, either when people retire or when they get sick. And so insurance companies, pension companies, mutual funds, banks, these are all, somewhat related, all mainly specializing in smaller savers and smaller investments. So I realize that's kind of a lot to pour on you, particularly for those of you who don't have much experience in this. And so that's why I say, do make sure, if you feel like your knowledge of the financial system is kind of shaky, to make sure you spend a little bit more time reading through chapter 10 so that you kind of can get some of these definitions down. Because I think really at the end of chapter 10, most of it is just kind of terminology and lingo, right? Okay, so I went over 15 minutes, but remember, I'm giving you this nice gift, no class this afternoon, all right? My gain, which is I have 50 meetings this afternoon. No, that's my loss, isn't it? My loss is your gain, right? So, thanks so much for your attention. I realize today felt a little bit rushed, but there's just always a lot to cover. Take a little bit of time off this weekend. Remember, this is really the end of the material that's going to be on your first exam on Tuesday. So spend a little bit of time this weekend going back, reviewing, get together a set of questions that you'd like to ask, and we will have a chance to have a review session Monday afternoon where we can go over all of this stuff again. Okay. All right. Have a good weekend, right? Relax, enjoy, get caught up. And I will talk to you on Monday when we will pick up in chapter 9, where we're going to start talking about economic growth. Okay. All right. See you, everybody.